When you're reading then go to stop position.
Okay, good morning, colleagues and friends. Welcome back to the second session of the day. My name is Samir Bhattacharya. I am the head of department of economics and professor of economics, the University of Sussex. We are very honored to have Professor Sir Tim Besley with us today, delivering the inaugural Michael Lipton Memorial Lecture. Tim needs no introduction, but for those of you who are not familiar with Tim's work, Tim is perhaps the leading contemporary British economist to have influenced economic theory and policy on development, political economy, and matters as important as war and peace. Tim is a school professor of economics and political science and W. Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics in the Department of Economics at LSE. He's also a member of the National Infrastructure Commission and was president of the Royal Economic Society. He was president of the Econometric Society and was an external member of Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society and British Academy. He is also a foreign honorary member of the American Economic Association and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Tim's work follows a long tradition of political economy research and progressive ideas in Britain, perhaps going back to Adam Smith. Smith's inquiry into the role of state in the wealth of nations is widely known. Some of the lesser known contributions is Smith's lectures on justice, police, revenue, and arms, delivered in University of Glasgow. A century later, Alfred Marshall continued with that tradition and perceived the role of economics is to improve material conditions, but only in connection with social and political forces. This rich tradition gave rise to important work on public economics and the role of government in advanced economies. This tradition was later adapted to the study of market failure, dualism, and government failure in developing countries. Arthur Lewis's pioneering work on surplus labor is a case in point. It is perhaps fair to say that Michael Lipton followed this tradition and devoted his professional life towards understanding the causes of poverty trap in developing countries such as Bangladesh, Botswana, India, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and South Africa. So what unites Tim and Michael then? Michael and his contemporaries were approaching the question of development from the standpoint of addressing the challenges to neoclassical optimality in an economic equilibrium in a developing country setting, dare I say. We see demonstrations of this in the farm size productivity debate or land reforms, interlinked contracts, and other related literature where economic equilibrium is treated in isolation from a potential political equilibrium. Whereas Tim and others approach the question of long-run economic development as an interplay between economic and political equilibrium. They demonstrate that history and political institutions matter immensely for long-run prosperity. It is perhaps fair to say that by blending history, politics into the notion of neoclassical optimality, Tim and colleagues have inspired a generation of doctoral scholars in the noughties, myself included. Blending history and politics into mainstream economic theory is no mean feat. So without further ado, let me invite Tim to enlighten us on the topic of political change and structural transformation. Tim will speak for an hour, and there will be time for a few questions at the end, both from the floor as well as online. Tim, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for that lovely introduction and remarks connecting my work to Michael. Some people you can't quite remember when you first met them, but I absolutely know when I first met Michael, because he interviewed me for the fellowship at All Souls College in 1984. And I remember that we were shown into a room packed full of rather intimidating looking people, almost exclusively men, I should say. I think that would be different today. And I was told by the domestic bursar as I was walking into the room, don't worry, they're all asleep. Of course, Michael was anything but asleep and was my first interlocutor. And he opened up by citing Wordsworth. Well, if he asked me to discuss the recent football scores, I'd been in good shape. But Wordsworth, I had at least heard of Wordsworth, but I couldn't make head nor tail of the quote that he'd given me. And at that point, I knew I was a class apart in many ways from Michael. But after he clearly didn't object to my election, since I was elected to a fellowship, and I owe it to Michael, I'm sure that he could look past all my frailties and thought that I had some potential. After that, we became, I wouldn't say close friends, but certainly we spoke a lot. And because he was a regular attendee at the college Gordies that took place 3 times a year, and invariably we got to sit together and talk about various themes in his work and the emerging themes in mine. And so it was a great period of my life to be able to get to know Michael and to appreciate his intellect, which we heard about before in the earlier session. I remember one particular episode where I out-Michaeled Michael, which was a very unusual thing to do because of his incredible analytical mind. But we were at a conference in Early in Virginia that later became a book called Including the Poor, which Michael co-edited with Jacques van der Gaard. And at dinner, I'd recently been back to All Souls, funnily enough, it connects back, and had dinner with a mathematician called Marcus de Sotoy. Some of you may know him and his books. If you haven't, I encourage you to discover them. And Michael had posed a mathematical puzzle over dinner. And I thought, well, I'll try this one out on Michael. And so late in the evening, over dinner, I'm not going to tell you what the puzzle is, otherwise we'll all be here all day. I posed this puzzle to Michael, and quite to my surprise, he didn't instantly find the answer. Obviously, didn't fit into a chess paradigm. And Michael got increasingly exercised through the evening that he hadn't instantly got the solution. Well, anyway, the next day, I went out for a walk with someone who's now a close colleague, Robin Burgess, who was also at the conference. And we were walking along, and who should come running, literally running, in the other direction, as we heard earlier. Michael was a keen runner. And as he passed us, he said, I've got it. How much of the night I kept him up, I've no idea. But I did feel a minor sense of triumph, given that I'd expected Michael to get the answer immediately. So Michael was someone definitely who had an influence on me, and as we heard earlier in my online remarks, it's certainly true that I felt through Michael I could get a certain amount of self-confidence for doing things that were outside of the mainstream, because Michael never really fitted into what you might call the mainstream as I was schooled in it, but all the same was making really remarkable and decisive contributions. And not least, and I could come back to something again we heard in the previous session, interdisciplinarity, was key to Michael. He didn't see that there were boundaries between disciplines, and that's something I've tried to emulate to some extent in my own work. Sometimes it's interpreted as trespassing. I've done my best not to see it that way, but I've spent a lot of time trying to think about other fields of economics. And indeed, I see some of his seminal work on questions about efficient but poor as really starting to sow the seeds of the literature on behavioral economics, which has now been firmly integrated into modern economic thinking. But I want to start with Gunnar Myrdal, because I discovered only after Michael passed that he'd been so closely influenced by him early in his career. And it turned out that quite coincidentally, when I was writing my 2011 book with Torsten, because Torsten is based at the International Institute for Economic Studies in Stockholm, which Michael had been visiting to work with Gunnar Myrdal, and Gunnar Myrdal indeed was the founder of the Institute. And so when we'd written our book, and quite late in the process, we found this quote, which I've got to say I probably overused by now, but it was Myrdal's take on what is development. And what's interesting about it, although Myrdal nominally or in fact was an economist, he understood development in a much wider sense of the term. And he says the only logically tenable definition is the upward of the entire social system. And that means politics, society, institutions, and attitudes. And in many ways, this is very impressive, because I think if people study development today, this is very much the way I think we think in modern development terms, that it's not confined to a technocratic, economically centered view about the way the world changes. It's one in which many aspects, politics, society, are all changing in particular ways. And I don't know what Michael's thought would have been. And of course, we're all sad that although this is in some ways a celebratory occasion, I would like nothing more than to hear what Michael's take was on both this quote and also on the lecture I'm going to give today. Now, when I was a young economist, my first job was at Princeton, and when I started in the department there, on very early, first or second day I was there, I ran into a senior, I'm not going to name names, a senior economist, someone with whom I'm very close now, who asked me what I worked on. And at the time, I had quite eclectic interest, but I included in the list of things I was working on, I included development, since I had some claim that I had interest in that direction. And the conversation was going well until I said I was interested in development, and suddenly a frown came on the face of this senior figure. He said to me, well, I used to be interested in development, but then I realized all the problems of development were political, and therefore my competence as an economist was irrelevant to studying development. And at the time, I just felt crestfallen. I didn't really know what to make of it. But interestingly, ever since, I guess I moved more and more to the view that without studying political change and political dynamics, one can't really study development. And that's been over the period of time since then, which would have been in the late 1980s, I think we've seen a real sea change in the field. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to review some work I've done in the past. I'm going to talk about work much more recent way, and I'm going to end up with literally work that's hot off the computer. So I'm going to kind of take you through all of that. You never know how to pitch these things. The reason we've got to finish at 10 to 12, I'm told there's a rock band coming down the front here. And I'm one of those people who gets annoyed when I go to a rock concert and people always want to play their new material. I only go to see them because I like all their old material. So I'm going to try and reach a balance between giving you some new material and some things that you may already have known about. And I'm very interested, I will leave time for conversation at the end, because I really do want to get your reaction. So I'm going to start with what I considered a more or less standard view. I'm going to discuss a supplementary view where I think economists have been playing catch up with political science, by the way. And then I'm going to talk at the end about some preliminary work in progress. Okay, let me begin sort of very big picture with two views of the state. And of course, this is always a very simplistic thing to think in terms of. But I think there are two broad traditions. The Leviathan view, which I associate with Hobbes and Weber, that state coercion authority is central to having an effective state. And therefore, investments in coercive compliance are what you really need to create state effectiveness. And I'm caricaturing that view, but I'm going to call that the Leviathan view. The other view is the social contractarian view that I associate with Locke and Rousseau, but there are many writers, where you think of the state not in terms of top-down authority, but in terms of a form of social contract in which citizens and states have mutual obligations. And creating an effective state is building trust between state and citizen to get things done, to meet the challenges. Now, why do I raise this distinction? Because I would say the state in economic models, certainly the ones I was schooled in, and even the ones we teach today, is very much more influenced by the Leviathan view of the state than it is by the social contractarian view of the state. And even when the state is benevolent, it's still a kind of Leviathan, meaning that we as economists think of what's a good economic policy, and then we take this sort of abstract idea. What would a benevolent dictator maximizing a social welfare function do in this situation? And then all you need to do is to give that dictator sufficient powers, that's where it links to the Leviathan view, to get this thing done. There's no need for politics. Politics is always a nuisance in that view of the world. So economists have a very dim view of politics because it gets in the way of people doing the stuff that economists think the state should be doing. And there's very little debate about the need for political institutions. And the economist, I'm deliberately offering you a very a straw man here. The role of the economist then is to aid better technocratic policymaking. So we all head off to the World Bank or whatever and try and persuade them to do the thing that we think would be optimal from the perspective of this mythical benevolent dictator. And our obsession is then with architecture rather than scaffolding, as I like to call it. Scaffolding is boring. We don't have any, as far as I know, brand name scaffolders in Britain, but we have a lot of brand name architects, and we worship our architects. But the people who really get building done are the people who put up scaffolding and build the building inside it. And it's actually, I got this idea, well, I heard it from Paul Collier, but then I researched it a bit. I got this idea from Marjorie Perham. I don't know if anyone here knows who Marjorie Perham was, but if you read her work, she very much had the idea of making development as a form of building scaffolding, to build the structures that support society and support the economy as you build inside the scaffolding. So I like this analogy. I'm not going to use it extensively now, but to some extent, I guess I've got more interested in scaffolding and less in architecture as a result of the research program I'm talking about today. What are the things you need to prop up things during the process when you're trying to build something better? And of course, the state and economic models, and to some extent we heard about it this morning, the view I think of Arthur Lewis would fit into this very well, that state-led development, if only you could get more benevolent dictators out there, is the way to go. Okay, so that's a very sort of brief overview. Where does political economy come in? Well, political economy, is basically trying to create the circumstances in which you can emulate the benevolent dictator world. So we know you don't have benevolent dictators. We know that doesn't happen. So what you're trying to do is to build around the political institutions. You're trying to build them so as to get as close as possible to that model. How do you do that? You design institutions and representative institutions to try and get some kind of distributional outcomes. And you build restraints. You build checks and balances, and you try and say solve time inconsistency problems with independent agencies. So there's a whole set of theoretical and other frameworks around how you get closer, or how we try to get closer to that model being not just an ideal model, but being actually the way government really works. And of course, that's very difficult. The other thing, of course, that I'm not going to talk about today, but I'll just put a mark on it, is how do you also deal with the problem of political violence? Having created a state with the kinds of powers that the benevolent dictators would want in the classic economic perspective on the state, you have all manner of problems of how you constrain and prevent the use of political violence for malign ends. And so you need to be very mindful of that. And these are very big issues, but they're not, not really going to talk about them today. Now, what this given way to, and this has been an exciting period for me, at least in my career in the last 20 years or so, is an interest in dynamic models in political economy. The kind of previous generation of work by economists studying politics was very static in nature. It really was about the who gets what type of problems, but very little about the dynamic forces that change institutions, change society, lead to investments, both in the state and in the economy. And so you need dynamic models. Those dynamic models were confined to the comfort zone of economists for the longest period, where for most of the things that were changing were the things that we can write down comfortably in our models, meaning investment, we're always happy with that. Even institutions changing the rules of the game, we're happy with that. The thing that started to come in more recently, I'd say in the last 10 years, is much more attention to the dynamics of norms, values, and preferences. Again, these are things that, of course, in other disciplines have been part of the currency for a long time. But this has now been brought much more into economics, and is part of that Myrdal quote I gave you. Myrdal said this is a central part, and in fact, one of my regrets in life was I once started to write a paper with Albert Hirschman. I became quite friendly with him when I was at Princeton, and we used to meet regularly. And we had the idea to write a paper on this topic, on the dynamics of norms, values, and preferences during development. And he, at the end of our plan for this paper that never got written, he went to his cupboard and presented me with a copy of the Strategy of Economic Development and showed me the pages in the Strategy of Economic Development where he was dealing with this issue. And he wrote a beautiful inscription, which is a treasured item, to Tim after a meeting of minds, which I thought was a lovely way, and then he signed it from Albert. But he and I worked somewhat on this, but never wrote the paper. So it's a regret that I don't have a publication with Albert, who was a wonderful fellow, as all of you who knew him will know. Okay, so I put my toe, well, more than my toe, I put my whole leg in the water, I guess, on this topic in the state capacity agenda, which I've been developing with Torsten Persson. And I'm going to give you just a very brief executive summary because I can't presume you're all familiar with the work we've done in this space. But the idea that we were pursuing, or are still pursuing in this agenda, is how can you get a state that can feasibly do the range of things we want the state to do? And I was very struck when I learned my economics of public policy and public intervention, how the problem was to get the state to do it, not really about how the state had the capacity to do it. And so that was like the architecture, not the scaffolding. So it's fine, we could say tomorrow, and I've been in debates recently, and this is not made up, a debate about how do we do a carbon tax. Well, there's all these plans to do carbon taxes in parts of the world that can barely levy any other form of tax. But it doesn't stop the IMF just saying, well, go levy a carbon tax. You think about, and I know Nick is familiar with this, with the great work he's been doing in his tax center, there's a huge set of issues you have to overcome before you can take a technocratic edict like have a carbon tax and turn that into something real that people will comply with and will even adopt. So it's really about that, how to build that scaffolding around not just tax systems, legal systems, and other things. It's multidimensional. Fiscal capacity is key. Legal capacity is important. How do you have a legal system that can enforce the rule of law? And we use a third term, collective capacity, to describe those things that allow you to spend well. Because we argue you can't build a state in which you persuade people to part with large fractions of their income unless you can persuade them that you're spending that money responsibly. So all of these three are connected. And the way we think of structural transformation in this framework is that the state begins to do a set of things through history that the state simply had been absent from before, but it can't do it unless it builds a capacity to deliver. So you can take different examples of this. I like to take taxation, it's an obvious one to do. So the left-hand panel is just to remind you that if you look over the 20th century, and this is albeit for a small but selection of countries, but that reasonably represent no low-income countries, but middle and upper-income countries. you see something that nobody is going to be surprised at, that the 20th century was a period of the transformation of the state in the way the state levied taxes. And it wasn't just levying more taxes, it was introducing new tax bases. So the orange dotted line, dashed line, is particularly important in that respect. If you go back to 1900, virtually none of the tax that's being levied by state is through income taxes. Personal income taxes were almost non-existent. The US even had a constitutional prohibition on a federal income tax. So they had to change the constitution in the US to introduce an income tax, a federal income tax. And then over the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, roughly half of the revenues raised by this group of countries are coming from the income tax. So these are structural transformations, and you think about all the things you need to do to build a state that can actually levy half of its tax revenue from income taxes. The right-hand one is another example of state capacity, which is the information capacity of the state. When did states start doing the kinds of things that you need to do effective public intervention, like running a census, having a statistical agency, having a population register? All of these things have been growing capacities of the state, and they don't happen by accident. They happen by design. And if you think about what that design is, you almost certainly have to start thinking about the political institutions that enable for this stuff to happen. And that's what the work with Thorsten was about. How do you get those investments in the state? And you can think of these investments as a form of infrastructure, but not physical infrastructure, but what is now often called in the investment literature, intangible infrastructure. It's often reorganizing the state to make it capable to do this stuff. And of course, that depends on the state being future-oriented, and that depends on who controls the state and how power is used and all manner of issues, which gets immediately into politics. And I'm not going to get into that in any detail at the moment. But issues around political stability, the nature of the political settlement, whether you have peace, repression, or civil war, all these things are important. And also the nature of the political coalitions that form, and whether you can get a political coalition together that will pursue common interests rather than sectional interests in the management of the state. So that's the story up till now. It's a story that has some empirical legs. So I'm going to give you a very broad brush look at that. Just show you two things using a measure. So in my work with Thorsten, we put a lot of emphasis on the role of executive constraints, the checks and balances on executive power, as being a key part of the story. It's very hard to build an effective state unless you have that. And this is a measure of the tax share in GDP against average executive constraints over the period since the state was born, so to speak, for these countries, and you get a strong positive upward sloping line. And this is a measure of property rights protection, and similarly looking at average executive constraints. So we concoct an argument, I haven't got time to go into it, around why we would expect this to be true, and then it's consistent with these patterns in the data. We argue that basically the world, and this is a crazy thing, but I'm going to try and show you something to make it look just a little bit less crazy, that there are really essentially three kinds of states in the world. We call one set common interest states. They're peaceful, they have strong state capacities in all dimensions. Special interest states, think of the Gulf kingdoms today, they're repressive, they have some elements of state capacity needed, not least because the repressive dictators have to stay in power, and sometimes it's convenient to provide things like health systems and so forth to do that, but they're essentially, they're built on repression. And then there are weak states, which have neither mastered the art of repression nor peace, and are generally conflictual, where there's continual contest for authority, and they generally have weak state capacities. Okay, fair enough. I'm just going to show you something to suggest I'm not quite as, this idea isn't quite as implausible as it might seem at first sight. This was something we did recently when we discovered that you could do this with machine learning. You can take a set of state characteristics and you can say to a computer, so you can't be accused of cooking it to fit the theory, I'm going to give you a set of state characteristics, and you're going to sort the states into clusters, and you're going to decide A, how many clusters there are, and B, which countries belong in which clusters. So I've done this now for lots and lots of different characteristics. The version I'm going to show you is basically for two dimensions, a state capacity and income dimension, and a political violence dimension. So we just sort the countries. And essentially, this is what the clustering looks like, roughly speaking, where on the dimension 2, that's peace versus repression. That's sort of moving in the positive orthant is more conflictual states, moving in the negative orthant is more repressive states, and along the horizontal axis is increasing state capacity. And what you see is that there's 3 clusters. We didn't tell the computer to go look for 3 clusters. The computer told us the work. And of course, we want to use the term that the green dots up there, we've labeled all the countries. I'm not going to give you time to digest it all, are the common interest states. The blue are the special interest states, and the red are the weaker states. Now, whenever anyone sees this, I showed this on Friday to a group of in our executive program, and there was someone from India who almost leapt off his chair and contested India's location in the red. But that's the whole point. It's meant to get us thinking. I don't claim this is hard and fast knowledge, but it's a very good place to start debating why does any state belong in any place here, and what is it that's driving that. What's interesting is something we did for a chapter in the World Happiness Report that came out earlier this year. We just took our state classification and we took the Gallup World Poll and we looked at life satisfaction measures and we plotted them. So we plotted the 3 groups of countries against something we call the Pillars of Prosperity Index, which is essentially an amalgam of these things. And lo and behold, and we didn't know that we'd get this when we did, the common interest states are all at the top right. Actually, the very top performing state, I gave this talk in Australia recently, so I said to my research assistant, where's Australia here? It turns out Australia is the top of the life satisfaction and the state capacity index. Anyway, you have a bit more of a mixed bag among the red and the blue dots. We call that the Anna Karenina principle, that once you get outside being a common interest state, there's lots of sources of ill-being. Sorry, I could have unpacked that idea. I'm trying to be all educated like Michael would likely to be. It's that opening quote in Anna Karenina: all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unlike in their different in their own way. And that's sort of what we see. We see a collection of states that manage to get to a point where they're peaceful, they have high levels of state capacity. There are many states that haven't achieved that, but they're really rather more heterogeneous. Okay, so what's missing? Lots of things are missing, of course. But I would claim that this whole research program, as we conducted it, unwittingly, we conducted it in the shadow of Leviathan. We always thought that the route to state success was more top-down state power, and as long as it was used for the good of society, that was a great thing to do. And I think there's a tradition in development that sort of mirrors that. And all of the aims of building political institutions should be to emulate that model. And therefore, what we should crave is more coercive compliance, because coercive compliance is needed to deliver on state capacities, but then be careful about constraining its use. So you want a state to be strong but constrained. And of course, that completely neglects the social contractarian tradition. It doesn't even engage with it. So I guess the next phase of the work I want to describe is my attempt to take this agenda, but to engage with the social contractarian tradition. And the person I've probably been more influenced by on this than anyone else is Margaret Levy. But I know, having talked to Mick in the past, there's a quite rich tradition in political science. But Margaret's work was my own particular way into this. For those who don't know it, I strongly recommend it. The book that I just puzzled over when I first read it it's called A Rule and Revenue, because it wasn't the same view, but it was saying the same thing. In other words, her view was that, yes, a really important part of what's changed about states is their capacity to raise revenue. But she was telling a very different story, that it was the rise of what she called quasi-voluntary compliance. So it wasn't a story of top-down coercive power at all. It was a story of building trust in the state so that people would voluntarily comply with their taxes. And she wrote a subsequent book, which is also really excellent, called Consent, Dissent, and Patriotism, which is why people volunteer for military service. And she made a sort of similar argument. She called it there, not quasi-voluntary compliance, but conditional consent. That people are willing to put their lives on the line, but only if they feel that the causes for which they're being asked to fight are relatively just. While these ideas are, I think, pretty well developed within political science, they're not so integrated yet into the economics agenda on state effectiveness. out of this, ironically, I wrote a paper. It came out in a journal called Econometric in 2020, and I sent Margaret an early draft. And needless to say, even though she doesn't read mathematics really, she was very taken. Last year's some economists taking her ideas seriously because I was trying to model the ideas. And I got to know Margaret very well, and we're writing a book together, but not on any of this stuff. We're actually writing a book on political equality together and how to understand political equality. So a great byproduct of my research has been to get to know Margaret and to be working with her, albeit on a different project. So I'm going to turn to trust now. One thing, there's lots of measures, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the data in a minute. There's lots of measures of trust in government, and people will complain about measures. I'm doing quite a serious empirical project, looking at different measures and different data sets to see how well they all shape up, and I'm not going to bore you with that today. But one thing you do see, and this is only for the European sample, and there's a reason why this is only true in the European sample, there is an upward correlation between measures of state capacity and trust in institutions. And I wouldn't necessarily ask you to believe anything is causal here, just that there is a correlation. I'm using this as my sort of warm-up to what I want to talk about next. Why do I stress the point it's across Europe? Because there is a sort of trust paradox. I'm going to end up not solving the trust paradox, but at least engaging with it right at the end of the story. That if you ask a global data, so use the Gallup World Poll or you use the Integrated Value Survey, the World Value Survey, you tend to find that the countries where people really trust their government are places like China. So the idea that it's democratic societies that create trust is not in the data. And that's something I've been puzzled. I call that the trust paradox now. So I'm encouraging you to use that term because what we don't see is the kind of thing that we as attached to our Western liberal traditions would hope to see, that all the trusting places are the places where there are well-established liberal democratic institutions. But at least within Europe, you see this positive correlation. So all of this is kind of coming back to compliance with the state. So all of my current projects are one way or another engaging with compliance, partly because I became very fascinated with this during the pandemic. We had a very unusual period in which we were being asked by the state to do all sorts of things that we didn't really want to do, like staying home and wearing face coverings, and even some people didn't like the idea of getting vaccinated. And it made me start thinking, well, what's driving this compliance? Because we had in this country quite high compliance rates. Of course, they were lower in other parts of the world, and so I started thinking about this. Now, on the narrow view of compliance, which is the one economists have always embraced, it's fear of punishment and sanction, which means goes back to the Leviathan view. A strong state is one that punishes and sanctions people more effectively. Whereas the view that I'll call it the political science view, but particularly in Margaret's work, is a trust-based relationship between the ruling elite and the citizens. So Sweden was an outlier in this. For those of you who don't remember back that far, Sweden didn't have a lockdown, at least for the longest time. It just tried to encourage its citizens to change their behavior without either having any formal sanction or actually engaging in any restrictive movement policies. Subsequently, it had to relax that, did close the schools and all that kind of stuff. But it was very much a notion, we trust the citizens to do the right thing. All our job is to steer them in that way. And the way you can think about that is, you know, if you trust the state to be doing the right thing, you feel a reciprocal sense of obligation to reciprocate that by doing the right thing yourself. So you think of the state as an essentially trustworthy institution, and your willingness to comply. Now, trust and reciprocity is interesting. What we know from lab experiments is reciprocity is an incredibly strong motive, that even when it's costly to you in the lab, people are willing to pay quite a price to punish transgressors, even when there's no benefit to themselves of doing that. So it's not about, oh, I'm going to meet this person next week. These are in one-shot environments where people are never going to see this person again. And if they see someone who's behaving non-cooperatively, they're willing to lower their own payoff to punish someone for doing an act that they think is antisocial. And equally, people are willing to reward people for good actions, even again, where there's no prospect of it having some future benefit. So these norms of reciprocity, I think, are powerful. And I think that what hasn't been explored so much from this is sort of small scale stuff is how that affects citizen-state relationships and how it can underpin effective states. Now, there are interesting literature. I'm not going to, I could go about this all day, but you can go back to the biology literature. So Robert Trivers, I don't know if anyone read his work. He's an evolutionary biologist who started life studying birds and observed reciprocal behavior in bird populations, and is credited with being, along with, of course, one of the great figures of the University of Sussex, Maynard Smith, in getting people thinking about reciprocity and other things in an evolutionary model. So Trivers definitely was early to that party. I don't think, though, that we think that, well, we could believe that this is entirely a biologically determined instinct in human beings, that we've inherited it along with the birds and everybody else, and that we just have a sort of instinctive reaction to poor behavior to want to punish it. The kind of view that I've got interested in is more rooted in evolutionary psychology, and that's the cultural learning theory of reciprocity, that societies teach the power of reciprocity, even simple things. Think of the stories your parents told you when you were a young child about how the bad person got punished and the good person got rewarded. It always got, it was trying to invoke a sense of a belief in reciprocal obligation. And it becomes sort of hardwired. So the philosopher and neuroscientist Celia Hayes has a book called Cognitive Gadgets. And I like the concept of cognitive gadgets. So the brain is like hardware, and our social experiences are like an upload of software into the brain. So we have experiences. Those experiences then become part of our neuropsychology, and then they become instinctive. So it's not like we're constantly calculating. So you'll know Danny Kahneman's distinction between system 1 and system 2 thinking, that this becomes a part of our system 1 thinking because the software has been uploaded to make us behave that way. So it is a culturally learned thing. It's very often attached to the learning of language, the kinds of folklore and experiences we're exposed to. Okay, so I'm going to argue, I do argue that state capacity is very important. Sorry, reciprocity is very important. State capacity is that citizens could get into a reciprocal relationship where they reward government with costly acts of compliance, like obeying the law and paying taxes, and punish governments for bad behavior by cheating on taxes and civil disobedience. And that we can think, in using Margaret Levy's term, that therefore compliance with the state is quasi-voluntary, and that ties trust and compliance together. I don't want to go into this too much, the only equation in my talk, but you can write down an evolutionary model, and I've done that, that's what I did in the paper I sent to Margaret, that shows, that tries to anchor reciprocity in cultural fitness. What's cultural fitness? That's when you learn a trait that is going to be a high payoff trait in the society you live in. So when we're younger, if we're constantly, if the traits that we've acquired are constantly punished in the society we're in, that's not going to be a good reinforcement mechanism. And that could be a psychological connection. So I just, get a psychological payoff by obeying the norms of the society, or it could be my material payoffs. People who disobey the norms of society are punished materially. It doesn't really matter. And you can write down these cultural evolution models. They're quite nice structure. But the key part of the model is it looks a lot like a biological evolution model. What's different about it is you can think about the role of institutions and other things in society that create cultural fitness for certain traits. So if I live in a society where bad governments are punished by losing elections and things like that, that's going to allow me to learn a cultural trait that says we expect good government behavior and we're going to reciprocate good government behavior, not just in voting out the guys who behave badly, but also in terms of our willingness to reciprocate a sense of obligation with the state. That's in a nutshell what the argument is. And what you get is divergent cultural dynamics, meaning that some societies can be moving in one direction while other societies move in others. And this can be linked back to the things that we studied in the original state capacity work, like constraints on executive power and so forth. Okay, so that gives a kind of framework for thinking, which is really rather different about the evolution of the state. Is it something that we should take seriously empirically, where we can use, I'm going to show you one data source. I've been looking at a lot of different data sources. I'm going to use 6 waves of the World Value Survey and 5 waves of the European Value Survey, which we can put together and call it the Integrated Value Survey, where we have measures on trust in government institutions and attitudes towards voluntary compliance. I did similar, I'm not going to talk about it today, I did something on panel data in the UK on compliance with measures during COVID, where we get very similar results, where we actually have, we can exploit within-person variation. But this is purely, I'm going to show you some cross-country variation and then some within-country variation. And essentially people are asked questions about, do you trust the following institutions a great deal, quite a lot, or not at all? I'm just going to create a dummy variable for a great deal, or quite a lot. And then I'm going to use a portmanteau measure of trust in government, but you can disaggregate it and find these are highly correlated with each other. So it doesn't really matter. Trust in government, justice system and court, parliament, police, and civil service. And then I'm going to use 3 measures of voluntary willingness to comply voluntarily. Would you be willing to pay higher taxes to protect the environment? Would you be willing to fight for the nation if called on? And do you regard it as justifiable to cheat on your taxes? That's always an interesting question to me. I'm sure Mick has looked at questions like this. It turns out about 65% of the global population say it's not justifiable to cheat on your taxes. That's the good news. The bad news is that, and this is good news for the women in the room, that the men are much more likely to say it's justifiable to cheat on your taxes than the women are. And high-income people are much more likely to say that too. Anyway, but we take basically an aggregate measure of each of these 3, and if you plot them against each other, this voluntary compliance index against the trust in institutions index, you do at least see something of an upward sloping relationship across countries. That's, you know, you could think of lots of reasons not to like looking at it this way. So here's a slightly different way to look at it, and that's to do regression analysis within countries, where you include a country fixed effect, so you're only exploiting within country variation, you're controlling for a whole slew of individual characteristics, age, gender, etc., education, geography, and so forth. When you do that, you again find a very strong positive correlation within countries between your confidence in the government, your willingness to fight for your country, saying it's bad to cheat on your taxes, I say you'd be willing to sacrifice income from the environment and then a portmanteau measure. So it does look like there might be something in this idea linking voluntary compliance to trust. Okay, but begs the big question. I'm sure I'm coming to my end of my time here. Where does trust come from? If trust is so important, what's the origins of trust? And one view is the origins of trust are the same thing that got you better investments in the first view of the world, the Leviathan view, which is just making your government very constrained. I already hinted that doesn't look like such a great view on the global scale, because it wouldn't explain why China is high on trust. So it at least has some plausibility, but it probably isn't going to come the muster when it comes to a satisfactory explanation. So the area that kind of gets interesting is to take this cultural evolution view seriously, that trust comes from our lifetime experiences, the kind of things we might have inherited from our formative years. It's interesting to explore that. And that's what the very latest work that I'm going to show you, the final 3 things I'll show you are sort of 3 hints about this, and they're no more than hints because it's based on ongoing work about why you get this heterogeneity in trust levels, and therefore maybe we can start to get to the question, how can you build better trust? The executive constraint story within Europe works reasonably well. Again, it doesn't work across the globe, so that it's not like that's completely without any evidence or foundation. Here's one, though, that I found very intriguing when I was trying to sort out why is China such a trusting place. Now, one thing we know about China, at least in the last 30 to 40 years, it's had some of the highest rates of economic growth. So we plotted confidence in government and the average 10-year growth rate across countries and found this. And interestingly, this does not hold. So one thing I want to clarify, because people get confused about this, there are 2 different measures in all of these survey data. There's what's called interpersonal trust. How much do you trust others? And there's trust in the government. People often just say, well, they must be the same thing. They are not the same thing. They are correlated with each other, but far and away they are not perfectly correlated. So if I drew you this picture, does interpersonal trust correlate positively with growth? The answer is no, you just find a flat relationship. This is a relationship that's specific to the trust in government questions. So this is not, this is questionable evidence. So I'll show you one thing that's marginally less questionable. What we did was and this is literally came off the computer this week, we said, let's actually not look at the cross-country variation. Let's look at the within-country variation across cohorts. And ask the question, if you take people who've lived in the same country for a period of time, but they've experienced different growth episodes, is it the case if you've lived through a period of higher growth in the same country, so now we're only looking within country, not between country at all, do you have greater trust in your government? So it doesn't tell you this is pristine causal analysis, far from it. But what it tells you is it's not just purely driven by cross-country differences. It's true even within country. And in fact, we did somewhere, I haven't got a slide on this, experiencing a recession, a serious growth recession, you get, and we do a kind of event study, you find that there's a collapse in trust in government following a period of that. That does link back to executive constraints, by the way. There's another lecture I could have given, which is on political instability and its consequences. The biggest predictor of political instability is weak executive constraints. And this is something I've been arguing. I mean, the growth volatility is incredibly strongly correlated with weak executive constraints. And if you look at the distribution of economic growth by political institutions, people typically look at the first moment and they find, oh, there's not much difference in the growth rates between democracies and autocracies. And then they say, therefore, it can't be democracy. If you look at the distribution of growth rates, you get a very clear story that you get a much more dispersed distribution of growth rates among the non-democratic countries, particularly those with weak executive constraints. So at one end, you have the Zimbabwe's of this world. At the other end, you have the Chinas of this world. And you get so you can think if you were behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance and you were trying to worry what kind of country would you want to live in, you weren't cared about whether you were like to have a decent growth performance, arguably you'd rather live in a country with weak executive constraints if you were doing some kind of maximum exercise, because a lot of the really bad growth performances in the world, long-term economic declines occur in countries with weak executive constraints. Anyway, that's not what I'm going to show you now. What I am going to show you now is that individuals' lifetime growth experiences, we've used a 20-year window because almost everybody surveyed in these survey data are above the age of 20. And you may say, well, it's more your formative years. There's a very strong correlation between your confidence in government and your personalized growth experience, even when you include country fixed effects, as we do in all of this. In fact, we just redid this with country times survey year fixed effects, and it's absolutely rock solid results. And everything we've thrown in, and we combined Gallup and we combined IBS, so there's sort of 3 million observations here. When you look at this within countries, so we think this is something worth investigating. We don't know what's going on here, but it does suggest that the origins of trust may be an interesting issue to investigate and may have an economic basis. That if you have countries that are particularly competent at generating economic growth, maybe that is a source of increased trust, because it doesn't make it any easier. I'm always wary of those type of things that are equivalent to telling an Olympian, if you want to win a gold medal, you just have to run faster. Well, it's a bit like that. Well, if you want trust in government, you have to grow faster. That's not much advice, but it's still interesting all the same. The other thing is hysteresis. Sorry, Shibanya in the coffee break. It's well known you're from Albania, I hope, about the fact that there's a really big hysteresis effect that you see in lots of the data on having been brought up under communism or actually from a country in Eastern Europe. And you can do that for years under communism, very strongly negatively correlated with confidence in government and trust in state institutions, and also negatively correlated with these compliance attitudes. So it does suggest, and we've been looking at the rate. So one of the critiques of the cultural evolution literature I hear a lot, and I am about to shut up and have questions, I promise, is, well, in economics, we know something about the speed of convergence. So we know the rate of accumulation of capital is somehow related to the savings rate. So we know that a country that's saving a lot, on average, is going to be growing faster because it's accumulating capital. And it's not quite that simple, as we all know, but we see that in the data. What are the kind of equivalent parameters we could look at to tell us something about the rate of cultural change? And maybe the rate of turnover of the population, but of course that's not quite going to do the job because people are influenced by their parents. And in fact, if you plot cultural attitudes across generations, they're very highly correlated across countries. They self-reproduce. But it does turn out that if you look at the former communist countries, there is some drift towards the younger generations being more trusting in their government. But then you can do a calculation. What would have to be the population replacement rate at which these countries would need to converge to the same attitudes as other countries? And the answer is about 150 years or something. So these things are very slow moving and seem to show quite a lot of hysteresis in the data. Okay, the end. I hope I didn't really need to persuade anyone of this, but political change is central to understanding the changing nature and scope of government and a central part of the development story, as Gunnar Myrdal, and I assume Michael, since I never had this conversation with him, would have agreed. But it needs to be embedded in studying dynamics, both in the data and in theory, dynamics of institutions, but more importantly, also the dynamics of attitudes, norms, and values. And this is an evolving research agenda. And if there's anyone in the room who's still thinking what they should do, please join in. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And I'll open the floor for questions. Please identify yourself. So perhaps we would start with Alan there, and then we can.
Okay, well, I'm Alan Winters. Tim, I've got, in a sense, I guess, 2 questions or comments. I mean, I'm living in Britain now. I wonder about resilience in the other way from your hysteresis results. I mean, how bad and for how long does government have to be before the sort of the magic erodes? Maybe you don't need to answer it. Maybe it's the next project.
I'd like to answer it. I won't give you satisfaction.
The second one is much more sort of gritty. I was very influenced, 12, 15 years ago by Douglas North's book, which looked at the number of NGOs in the country and argued that that was very, very deeply connected with development. And is that, in a sense, do you think there's a causal result from this sort of civil engagement, or is it actually a reverse from doing well, that people having lots of time to spend in NGOs?
I love your second question. I think it's a great research project to push further. I wasn't aware about Douglas North's claim, so I should go and chase that down now. I mean, of course, the direction of causality is really hard here, and you'll know from your time at DFID about the need to implement programs through NGOs where the state is failing. And so does that, the great debate being, does that then just weaken state capacity or substitute in a constructive way? And in the State Fragility Commission work we did, one of the things that was very noticeable, particularly more in peacekeeping than other places, that really was clear that, if you just position peacekeepers in a country on an open-ended basis, the incentive of that country to create its own capacity to keep order is then extremely weak. So we've had peacekeepers in Eastern Congo, or was it Western Congo? Wait a minute. Eastern Congo for a very long period of time, keeping the peace. And so the Congolese government has almost no incentive to step in and create order itself. And I think this question of where do NGOs therefore fit in, should there be very clearly defined sunset clauses to encourage countries? The guys, the sort of emergency and disaster guys are interesting, as you know, to talk about on this, because of course, when you have an emergency, you can't wait for the state to develop, you just got to pile in there. But then the question is, do you just, your long-term presence there start to become detrimental? Great research project. I know no one who's really cracked at it. Is a kind of dynamic thing. We know the statics of it, but the dynamics of it. On trust in the UK, one thing, one take on our recent travails is a glass half full. So the glass half actually is very easy to see. We've seen some episodes and incidents in government that have shocked our faith in government. But we've seen responses to those. So I'll take the proroguing of Parliament. Remember that? That seems like a minor indiscretion then, because it was so far in the past. I would argue that's something that should make us trust government more, not trust the individual concerned more, but government more, because the government misbehaved at the time. tried to push through a piece of legislation for open parliament, and the Supreme Court said no. That, at the end of the day, we should feel more secure that our institutions worked and not less secure. And they guard us against having people. Now, the question is, how many people like that do you get before things really erode? And a second dose of Donald Trump in America will really test the institutions. They've already had some dynamic impact in his behavior vis-a-vis the Supreme Court. So you can obviously damage institutions on an ongoing basis if you have people who really try to abuse them. But it's really the test of those institutions comes from those constitutional moments. And I'd say it's too early to judge, but I think we've come through quite well. We haven't just let those transgressions sit. In fact, we probably slightly overreacted now to things about parties and so forth. I mean, you'll all have your personal view on that, but come on, is it now a distraction? We made our point. We know what we were dealing with, and we know that person probably doesn't belong in public life. Just we have our own views. But the institutions have to get on and start doing their job that we really wanted to do, which is governing the country and making good policy.
Thank you. I'm Ray Kaplinski from IDS and Sprue. And of course, in all of our minds is how Michael would have responded to your presentation anyway. Can I begin with two small examples first and then try and ask you about the way in which history enters your analysis? If you think of the organization of the firm, Frederick Winslow Taylor in the 1890s developed a system of command and control from the top down. Henry Ford, who invented mass production, said, "I pay my workers to work, not to think." And the 20th century was dominated by a form of economic and social control, which was essentially a top-down, very large-scale system in which governance was executed at the very top, and the system handed things down in tiers through the welfare state all the way to prescribing on a national basis how individual decentralized institutions operate. The second empirical point is Richard Wilkinson, the next assets person, who showed how there was such a strong link between trust and civil society participation. I know you distinguished that from civil trust and state trust, but you showed how closely that was linked inter-country-wise and within the US to the degree of inequality. So my question about history is really, we're in Sprue, part of the business school, and Sprue is Chris Freeman and to some extent Carlotta Perez. Chris Freeman and Carlotta Perez are around waves of history. And the 20th century was dominated by this top-down wave of history in which governance was the Leviathan model, if you like. It was based on a technological and economic system in which the large scale and the tiered authority was functional to economic growth. Now, with the transition to the ICT wave, we're moving to a different type of economic organization in which distributed intelligence, distributed contributions to innovation, municipalism, local government is becoming increasingly important and functional to the generation of the system. And thinking of your Gunnar Myrdal point about systemic integration, I believe we are moving from a world of the centralized Leviathan model at this point in history to a much more distributed model which meets with you. So my question really is not about this particular perspective, but to what extent history is built into your model, because the data sets you've given us are really around the 20th century and the latter half of the 20th century. And that's a historically specific period and is an outdated one. It's collapsing now. As Alan said, we're losing our faith in government. I don't have faith in government, and I did 15 or 20 years ago. Hopefully with the transition to a new wave, we will rebuild trust in the state. And the Leviathan developmental state may have a different role to play. Forgive me for a long intervention.
No, they're really great points, and not ones I'm going to be able to respond to. I mean, for sure, there's a huge amount of hysteresis in the organization. So a famous business school case study. So Torsten and I actually wrote a paper on this that was only moderately successful. It is published now on this transition to decentralized organization, the implications for corporate culture in particular. And the famous business school case study, if anyone teaches it here, is IBM. So IBM is a very directed top-down organization that's basically providing most of the computing power for the world. And at some point, because of the advent of more decentralized, not network, but not mainframe systems, suddenly became a very inefficient form of organization. And then there's lots of discussion in the corporate governance literature. Did they respond properly? Could they adapt? And the story is often one about, well, their corporate culture was holding them back. Now, in the end, they did produce the IBM PC and they tried to respond, but everyone says that they actually, they didn't really respond. And other firms like Dell and all these other ones that we know grew up because they were unable to respond. But it was a story about the extent to which you are held back by the corporate culture you've got. Now, new entrants maybe are unencumbered by that. So you could imagine a world where new entrants come in and they have a more decentralized model. The rise of services, which came up only briefly in the previous session, is a big issue here. Maybe the top-down model, if you're running service-based firms, is a very poor model. I think another bigger question, and so it's too many issues in your very rich comments, is all the impact that AI is going to have on all of this. We had a really interesting lecture. If anyone doesn't know who Tyler Cowen is, he books a lot on AI. He gave us a really interesting lecture earlier in the week. And he juxtaposed two views of AI, by the way. He criticizes Darren Asimov's view of AI. Oh, it's going to finally make the social planning model work because we'll be able to develop a really smart computer to run our economies. And we won't have to worry about trusting government anymore because, maybe we won't trust the computer, but we'll do this computation. Versus a view which is Hayekian. Actually, this is finally the Hayekian world where everything will be done in a distributed, decentralized way. And we'll get the productive effects of chaos, but we have to live with the chaotic consequences of AI because the central planning of AI would just be impossible. We don't know what the future brings, and there's at least two extreme views about these things and how the world is changing. And as you say, completely, it affects our view about what kind of governance arrangements we want. And if you speak to people who are really gung-ho about AI, they will tell you we'll need to completely rethink our governance system because how are you going to build a role for government in this world with all of this other stuff going on? But great questions, but poor answers, as you can tell. And then on the civil society point, there is some evidence. It's not great evidence, but I'm affected by it because they started this work when they were at LSE. I don't know if you ever read the work by Ken Sheedy and David Stasavage on the link between civil society and the state. It's a little bit related to Alan's point. But one thing they observed, which is very strong empirical regularity, is that countries with greater religiosity have smaller states. And that's true if you look within countries as well as between countries. And their argument is that civil society kind of holds back the state, because if you have strong local networks and organizations, that gives you a much less incentive to build those state superstructures. So the US is one of the most religious countries in the world and has one of the smaller states. I'm not saying that's the answer to that, but even if you look within the US, those states in the US that have more religiosity also have to be the state. So there's this almost interplay between building things through civil society and building things through formal state structures, which is really poorly understood. But I think the issue, and then the link to inequality, because inherently, if you're going to do things in a more decentralized way, it's going to be more inequality. And that's a real issue in the UK for the current so-called devolution agenda. You have to take it on the chin. If we devolve more power, we're going to have more inequality. I know of no way around that. I know no society that's managed to resolve the issue that decentralization goes inherently with more inequality. And we have to make a choice whether we want to live with that or not. But that's a bigger issue than I talked about today. And I think that there's lots of brilliant questions and poor answers, as I said.
Alistair?
Alistair Smith, Sussex. To come back to some things that you said in response to Alan about the UK example, I take the point that maybe we shouldn't be too pessimistic about the effects of bad government behavior. But I recall that when you were talking about, I didn't mean to put the lights out, when you were talking about the way trust might erode, it wasn't just bad government behavior, it's also poor performance by the state in delivering public services. So the problems about the poor performance of British politicians come after a period of pretty poor delivery of government performance in core areas of state function, like the justice system, national defense, education, and the National Health Service. So maybe the combination of thinking of the combination of the two, which you yourself put forward, should make one more worried than one would be about bad politician behavior in isolation.
I completely agree, and let me just make it more pessimistic in a way. If those results, which need to be scrutinized, stand up on growth, well, if we're in for a period of stagnant growth, and growth really is highly correlated with trust in government, then we have to start worrying about people thinking that their government isn't delivering. Now, that's a weirdly economic-y take on it. I mean, if you look at by the way, I've just looked at lots of other measures of government, things that are linked perhaps to government policy. I mean, growth is more than just government policy, but it's got a lot of government policy elements. And it does look like economic growth seems to be the one thing that is driving that correlation. It's very hard to find it with other things that we think. Maybe deteriorating quality of the health service, we don't really have enough good data to be able to look at that. But it is one, I agree. If we're going to have deteriorating economic performance and deteriorating performance of the public sector, then maybe that will flip us into some vicious cycle of less trust and poorer performance across a range of things. So I can share your pessimism, but then, you know, what's going to be our response to that collectively? Are we going to think of either institutional or other forms of change that could help to lean against that? We can't just manufacture economic growth, as far as I know. There are things we'll do, like trying to get our investment rate back up to a reasonable level, which we've let go for almost a decade now, investing in human capital, particularly investing in low-end skill. There are things we can do, and we just have to do them urgently if we're going to have any chance of fighting these forces, because if they're going to have this bigger equilibrium effect on the social system, we have to be banging the desk and saying, beware, it's not just low growth, it's the other things that might come from it.
I'll go, Age, we have, perhaps we collect all the questions.
I collect them and then we'll do a wrap up.
We'll go Adrian, and then Andy, and then Mick, and then Peter, and we wrap up. Please be brief with your question.
Yeah, hi. So I'm from South Africa, and as you might know, the state is collapsing in South Africa. And we have this interesting phenomenon where the private sector are deploying their own staff to kind of run government departments or work alongside civil servants, but paid for not by the government. And this is making me, while some of the other remarks were going on, I was thinking, like, in your vision of how state capacity develops and changes, what role do you see for private sector? And like, obviously the model that South Africa's deploying is a bit weird, but you know, how would you think about that as a way of changing the trust in government?
Andy?
Just on the trust, international differences in trust levels. So I remember a Belgian economic historian, who I'm afraid I've forgotten his name, but so long ago, saying that former bits and parts of Europe that had been under imperial regimes, but previously, like northern Italy, coming out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had a different attitude to tax avoidance than other parts. That is, they developed almost a core belief that you mustn't pay taxes, you know. And I would say the same thing might be, if you're thinking about Schipponder's hysteresis, that the Poles would have a different attitude than the Russians would have, for instance, in terms of trust. Because they've got a new government and they're out of the yoke of the Soviet Union, which they really hated, you know. So it's kind of important to think of those differentials then. So that's the point.
Mick?
Thank you, Tim. That was terrific. And I think it was very appropriate to Michael's memory. I want to ask a slightly broader question about the way you're thinking about this. Virtually all our models of why particular countries, and countries is important, do well, whether it's growth or good government or common interest government or whatever, are essentially based on notions of internal evolution and some kind of socioeconomic dynamics within countries. The problem is that whatever version of that model you use over centuries, you end up talking about pretty much the same group of countries, which is kind of Western Europe plus a few others. And I mean, if we go back to the period we're talking about this morning, early development studies, there were really two big kind of competing paradigms. One was modernization theory that was, if I can say currently, was a very crude and simple version of what you put today in a much more sophisticated and more plausible way. But the other one was broadly dependency theory, which was arguing that the rest of the world is not doing well, in part because we, the rich, have done and are doing things to them. So I just have a little bit of discomfort. I mean, much as I appreciate your theory, we seem to be back again to the same kind of argument that it's to do with internal evolution within rich countries, and isn't there another part of the story? Yeah.
Peter?
Thank you very much, Tim, for a tour de force which really brings pillars of prosperity back up to date, as it were, in terms of your current thinking. Can I say to any students, if you haven't read Pillars of Prosperity, you really should. Tim's far too modest to promote it. Promote everyone else's book, but not his own in this regard. My question is, thinking about your twin emphasis on dynamics and this relationship between trust and growth, I'm minded of the literature which is 20 years or more old, which is political business cycle theory, which we spent a lot of time on quite some time ago. Typically there, we looked at single countries with high frequency data. What I guess now is possible is the kind of panel data analysis that you do with many countries with higher frequency data, looking at the relationship, obviously, between growth and other economic outcomes, not just trust, but other political variables. And I wondered if you thought that that's going to come again in terms of what we should be looking at.
Right, well, fantastic questions. How am I going to do? I'm going to tell you, I give you a quick reaction. I'll take them in reverse order because they're fresher in my mind, but I will get to the first one. I think you're right. There's going to be a renewed interest in political business cycles, partly because, it's not necessarily going to be a business cycle story, but it's going to be maybe a stagnation story as well. And we're going to start to think what politicians are going to do. We're about to enter an election phase here. The next year, the kinds of promises we get, the kinds of reaction we get, maybe the government is going to cut taxes. They tried it, didn't work very well for them about a year ago or more. But I think there will be renewed interest in these things. Why did we fall out of love with that stuff? Partly because we thought it was inconsistent with modest rationality, not full rationality on the part of the people who ought to be able to see through the fact that they're being bribed with their own money, and they were going to pay the consequences of that. Whether people, after a period of naivete, are going to be up for being fooled again, I don't know. I mean, look at inflation. People forgot about inflation, and now they're having to learn about it all again. Again, it's generational. Nobody much in this room had ever lived in an inflation environment. I remember my grandfather literally in tears as he watched his pension being depreciated by 1970s inflation. By the time he got to the end of the 1970s, his pension was about a third of what he'd expected. So these were real things to people, but they've been forgotten about. And so maybe we need, again, it comes to thinking about a richer psychological model about what people pay attention to and what they don't. But yeah, I think there will be a resurgence of interest. The whole geopolitics, Nick, is absolutely fascinating, and is not. It is part of the bigger agenda, and that's the area. If I had infinite time, I would have already tried to think more about. Because I think you're completely right. This is a closed economy story. Of course, it's not entirely closed economy in the sense that warfare has been a big driver. So There's different views about Western European exceptionalism, because it is clear that Western Europe had a growth in state strength, which was unprecedented in global history. I mean, that had, not that other states hadn't emerged in different parts of the world, but the nature of the state as it emerged in Europe in the early modern period was unprecedented in global history. And I think the interdependence driven by warfare, which is what Charles Tilley argued, is surely part of that story. And therefore the whole interconnectedness, where did colonialism come from? It then came from that. You know, once you created a strong state, you can go and suppress other parts of the world using the organs of the state that you've created. So surely this is important, and I'd love to say that this could be brought in, because surely you're right. That said, I mean, there was a period, people here worked on globalization. There was a period in which people sort of forgot, I think, the importance of country level institutions in a global world. I mean, the sad truth is that people often dismiss it as a narrow form of nationalism, but it isn't. At the end of the day, the nation state has been the most important determinant of individuals' well-being within those states. I would say it swamps global forces that you could sit here all day and debate that, and you'll give me great examples where I'm wrong, and I'll try and give you great examples where I'm right. There's no answer to it. But I do think the question of how global forces interact with all this is something I've parked and would love eventually to bring fully into the picture, because you're absolutely right. It's part of the story. What isn't a part of the story, and I just want to caution against, is I don't think there's a simplistic view of colonialism here. Let me give an example. I would like to remind people that Norway was a colony. We forget that, and as was Finland, alongside Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So the idea that colonialism is inevitably something that condemns you to being an impoverished nation forever. We need to be careful with that. There are good reasons why maybe Norway has done fine in spite of its being colonized by Sweden. But you know, colonialism is a complicated animal. That's all I'm going to say, and I'll leave it there. On imperial regimes, that's a really interesting one. I'd love to get the reference you were referring to. I'm kind of, again, it's a kind of hysteresis point. I'll make a claim that's almost certainly not true, but I'll make it anyway. If you look at the transition paths that different countries have taken into where they are now, so I'm going to stay in the green dot. So Nick is going to at least be unhappy. I'm only looking at the green dots. There's something quite interesting coming out of that. The number of those that made transitions from stable monarchy to democracy is quite fascinating. So a lot of those countries I just referred to, like Sweden, Spain is a bit more complicated, but the UK, France, of course, had a revolution. But Belgium, constitutional monarchy hasn't served us so badly as an institution once you do the constitutional bit. And that's, I think, because it was a sort of the culture of governance that was evolved by that probably was quite conducive to stable transition to what we call democracy. But I think, you know, you're absolutely right. And also the differences across Eastern Europe are there in the data, but this empirical regularity on average is still there. And then finally, to the sort of role of the private sector and what you can and cannot do is a little bit related to the whole NGO thing. What do you bring in, or what can you bring in to improve the workings of a state by learning from the private sector? I think occasionally we do it naively, and therefore it's not always successful. I do remember many years ago when I got interested, particularly in public sector bureaucratic reform, do you remember the new public management? I don't know how many people. It was a movement that started in New Zealand with the idea that government was failing because there weren't enough incentives in government. And the various people going around the world saying, we need to reform government to create an incentivized structure. And as long as we mimic the kinds of tools of the private sector, government would improve. Well, that's largely discredited, but I do remember an amusing meeting with McKinsey, who described the new public management as transferring failed ideas in the private sector into the public sector. We need to be careful that we need, there's of course a lot to learn from bringing in the private sector, but we need to learn the right things that are suitable to the task in hand. But we're very profound saying that.
So thank you, Tim. So let's just thank Tim one more time.